Steve Harvey broke down hearing a foster child's story. What he did next went viral. In a moment of unexpected vulnerability, the beloved host faced a heartbreaking truth that many choose to overlook. As this young child shared their painful journey through the foster care system, Steve was compelled to act, igniting a movement that would resonate with millions. Stay with us as we dive into this powerful encounter that changed lives and sparked hope. The studio was electric that day. Cameras were rolling, the audience was buzzing with anticipation, and Steve Harvey sat in his signature chair, ready for another episode. The set was pristine, the lighting was perfect, and everything felt like it was going to be just another successful taping. It was supposed to be just like any other day. Laughter, inspiring stories, and heartwarming moments that would make viewers smile from their living rooms. But then, a young foster child walked onto that stage. Their eyes were nervous, darting around the studio as if taking in every detail, every face in the crowd. Their hands trembled slightly as they approached Steve, and their gait was cautious, almost hesitant. The energy in the room shifted instantly, like a sudden change in weather. The audience's cheerful chatter began to fade. This wasn't going to be a typical interview. Steve greeted them warmly, as he always did. But he could sense something different about this encounter. There was a weight to it, a heaviness that hung in the air like fog. With a voice barely steady, cracking with emotion, the child began to speak. They talked about being moved from home to home, never staying long enough to unpack their bags or truly settle in. They spoke of feeling unwanted, invisible, like a burden passed from one family to another, without care or consideration. Each word cut deeper than the last, painting a picture of a childhood filled with rejection and uncertainty. The child described the nights spent crying alone in unfamiliar rooms, wondering what was wrong with them. They talked about watching other children get adopted, feeling the sting of being left behind again and again. They spoke of the longing for stability, for love, for someone to look them in the eye and say, "You belong here. You matter." The audience fell silent. You could hear a pin drop. The air felt thick with emotion. Steve's signature smile faded from his face as the reality of this child's pain became undeniable. His posture changed, his shoulders tensing as he leaned forward, fully absorbed in every word. As the child continued, describing the loneliness, the fear of abandonment, the desperate longing for someone, anyone, to truly want them. Something broke inside Steve. It was as if all his years of interviewing celebrities and hearing success stories suddenly felt hollow compared to this raw, unfiltered truth. His eyes welled up with tears. Then another, and another. Steve Harvey, the confident, charismatic host who had seen it all, who was known for his composure and quick wit, couldn't hold it back anymore. He broke down completely, overwhelmed by the raw pain pouring out from this child. His shoulders shook as he wept openly, his hands covering his face for a moment before he composed himself enough to reach out and embrace the child. The studio erupted in tears. Audience members were wiping their eyes. Crew members were visibly moved. In that moment, the carefully curated entertainment show transformed into something real, something raw, something that transcended television. But what Steve didn't realize in that moment was that his breakdown was about to trigger something far bigger than he could ever imagine. Something that would ripple across the entire nation, inspiring millions to take action and rethink how society cares for its most vulnerable children. The episode aired on a Tuesday evening, right at prime time when millions of households were tuned into their televisions. Within hours, clips of Steve's breakdown were being shared across every social media platform imaginable. TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, Facebook. The footage spread like wildfire, reaching millions of viewers in a matter of days. The video was being reposted, shared, and reshared at an exponential rate that even the platform algorithms couldn't keep up with. The comments section exploded with reactions of all kinds. People were moved to tears watching the video on their phones during their lunch breaks, their commutes, late at night when they couldn't sleep. Some shared their own foster care experiences, opening up about their own journeys through the system. Others expressed outrage at the broken system that had failed so many children over the years. Parents talked about considering fostering. Teenagers questioned why they had never learned about this crisis in school. The hashtag #TheSteveHarvey moment began trending worldwide, accumulating hundreds of millions of views and sparking countless conversations in living rooms, classrooms, and workplaces. What made this moment different from other viral videos was its undeniable authenticity. There was no filter, no performance, no carefully crafted narrative designed to manipulate emotions. It was pure, unfiltered emotion. A powerful reminder that behind the cameras and the makeup, behind the carefully constructed public personas, celebrities are human too. They feel, they hurt, they care deeply about the world around them. News outlets picked up the story with fervor. Major publications ran headlines across their front pages and digital platforms. Steve Harvey breaks down over foster child story. The moment that changed everything. Why this video is breaking the internet. Foster care crisis finally gets the attention it deserves. Cable news networks dedicated entire segments to discussing the foster care crisis, something that had long been overlooked and marginalized in mainstream media coverage. Journalists who had never covered this issue before suddenly found themselves researching statistics, interviewing social workers, and investigating the systemic failures that had allowed so many children to fall through the cracks. Political figures began weighing in on the conversation. Senators and representatives who had previously ignored foster care reform suddenly saw an opportunity, and more importantly, a moral imperative, to take action. Advocacy groups that had been fighting for years to bring attention to this issue found themselves with newfound allies and resources. The conversation had shifted from whispers in the corridors of power to a national dialogue happening in real time across every platform and news channel. But the viral spread wasn't just about the emotional moment itself. It was about what it represented, a collective awakening to a crisis that had been hiding in plain sight. For years, foster children had been invisible, their struggles ignored by society at large, their stories untold, their pain unacknowledged. They were statistics on a page, not real human beings with real dreams and real needs. Now, suddenly, millions of people were talking about them, thinking about them, caring about them in ways they never had before. The child who had shared their story found themselves at the center of a global conversation that extended far beyond what they could have imagined. Messages poured in from around the world, from people offering support and encouragement, from organizations wanting to help and provide resources, from families interested in fostering or adopting, from celebrities and influencers wanting to use their platforms to amplify the message. The isolation they had felt for so long, the sense of being unwanted and forgotten, was suddenly replaced by a profound sense of connection and hope. For the first time in their life, they felt seen. They felt heard. They felt like they mattered. Schools began incorporating discussions about foster care into their curricula. Community centers organized events to raise awareness and funds. Corporations pledged donations to foster care organizations. Religious institutions opened their doors to training sessions on how to support foster families. The ripple effect was undeniable and unprecedented. Steve's phone was ringing off the hook constantly. Producers, charities, nonprofits, celebrities, politicians, activists. Everyone wanted to be part of what was happening. His inbox was flooded with requests for appearances, interviews, partnerships, and collaborations. The moment had transcended entertainment and become something bigger, something more meaningful. It had become a movement for change, for justice, for the voiceless children who had been waiting for someone to finally listen to their stories. But this viral sensation was just the beginning of something much larger. What Steve Harvey would do next would prove that his tears weren't just for the cameras, weren't just a momentary emotional reaction captured on film. They were a catalyst for real, lasting, systemic change that would touch the lives of thousands of children and families across the nation. Steve Harvey didn't sleep that night. He sat alone in his home office, the soft glow of his computer screen illuminating his face in the darkness, scrolling through the endless stream of messages, comments, and stories flooding his social media accounts from every corner of the globe. Each one told a different tale of struggle, resilience, hope, and heartbreak. Some were from foster children themselves, bravely sharing their own deeply personal experiences of rejection and longing. Others were from dedicated foster parents, expressing the profound challenges they face daily while trying to provide love and stability to traumatized children. Many were from ordinary citizens, people who had never thought much about the foster care system before, asking the same urgent question over and over again. What can I do to help? How can I make a difference? The weight of these messages pressed down on Steve's shoulders. He realized that the viral moment had created an unprecedented opportunity. A window of time when the public's attention and compassion were focused on this issue. But windows like this don't stay open forever. If he didn't act quickly, if he didn't channel this energy into meaningful action, the moment would pass. The outrage would fade. The foster children would become invisible again. By dawn, after hours of reflection and contemplation, Steve had made a life-changing decision. This wasn't going to be a fleeting moment of viral fame that would fade away in a week or two, disappearing into the vast digital graveyard of forgotten internet sensations. This was going to be a turning point, a moment that would be remembered as the catalyst for real, systemic change in how America cared for its most vulnerable children. He picked up his phone with renewed determination and began making calls. To producers, to established charity organizations, to politicians at every level of government, to business leaders, to anyone who could help him transform this emotional moment into concrete, measurable action that would improve lives. His first call was to the National Foster Care Youth and Alumni Policy Council, an organization led by people who had personally experienced the foster care system. He wanted to understand the system better, to learn from those who had lived through it, to hear directly from the experts and survivors about what needed to change most urgently. The conversation lasted for hours, stretching into the early morning. Steve listened intently, taking detailed notes as they explained the sobering statistics. Over 400,000 children currently in the foster care system in America alone. Thousands aging out of the system each year without a stable home or support network. A crisis that had been building quietly for decades while society looked the other way. They told him stories that broke his heart all over again. Stories of children moved from placement to placement, never staying long enough to form attachments. Stories of teenagers aging out of the system at 18 with no education, no job skills, and nowhere to go. Stories of the overwhelming shortage of qualified foster parents. Stories of underfunded agencies struggling to do impossible work with inadequate resources. Stories of systemic racism within the system, with children of color being disproportionately represented and receiving fewer resources and opportunities. By the time he hung up the phone, Steve's vision had crystallized. He would use his platform, his resources, his influence, and his celebrity status to create a comprehensive initiative. Something that would go beyond mere awareness and actually make a tangible, measurable difference in the lives of foster children and families across the nation. This wouldn't be a charity that made him feel good about himself. This would be a serious, sustained effort to reform a broken system. Within a week, after countless meetings and planning sessions, Steve announced the Harvey Foster Care Initiative. During his show in front of a live studio audience, the moment was carefully orchestrated but deeply genuine. As he stood on that stage, looking directly into the camera, speaking from the heart, the audience erupted in thunderous applause and cheers. He outlined the program's ambitious, multifaceted goals: to increase widespread awareness about the foster care crisis, to provide comprehensive resources and support to foster families who are doing this difficult work, to advocate aggressively for policy changes at the state and federal level, and most importantly, to create a clear, accessible pathway for foster children to find permanent, loving, stable homes. The initiative would partner strategically with existing organizations that had been doing this work for years, leverage corporate sponsorships to secure funding, and mobilize celebrities, influencers, and public figures to amplify the message through their platforms. But more than that, it would be deeply personal. Steve pledged to personally visit foster care facilities across the country, to meet with children and families face to face, to hear their stories and understand their needs firsthand rather than from statistics and reports. He promised to use his voice and his reach to ensure that foster children were heard, seen, and valued. The response was absolutely overwhelming and immediate. Within 24 hours of the announcement, the initiative's website crashed multiple times due to the sheer volume of traffic overload. Donations poured in from individuals of all backgrounds and income levels, from corporations eager to demonstrate social responsibility, and from foundations dedicated to child welfare. Major companies pledged matching funds that would double the impact of individual donations. Other celebrities called Steve personally to ask how they could get involved, offering their platforms and resources. Universities reached out about research partnerships to study what interventions were most effective. It was as if a dam had broken, and all the compassion and desire to help that had been building in society suddenly had a channel through which to flow productively. But Steve knew that awareness and money alone weren't enough to solve a problem this complex and deeply rooted. Real, lasting change required systemic reform at every level. He began meeting regularly with legislators, sharing powerful stories of foster children, presenting data about the effectiveness of various interventions and policy approaches. He testified before congressional committees, speaking with passion and conviction about why this issue mattered. He worked closely with policy experts and foster care specialists to draft comprehensive legislation aimed at improving every aspect of the foster care system. From training requirements for caseworkers, to funding levels, to permanency outcomes. The child from that first episode, the brave young person whose story had sparked this entire movement, became the symbolic face of the initiative. Though they remained largely anonymous to protect their privacy and allow them to process their own journey. Their story, their remarkable courage in sharing their pain so openly and vulnerably on national television, had sparked something in the national consciousness that couldn't be undone. An awakening that would ripple outward for years to come. Foster care organizations that had been struggling for years in relative obscurity suddenly found themselves with abundant resources, dedicated volunteers, and unprecedented public support. Training programs for foster parents were expanded dramatically to meet increased demand. Mental health services for traumatized foster children were increased substantially. Educational opportunities and tutoring programs were enhanced. Adoption incentives and subsidies were created to encourage more families to open their homes and hearts to children in need. Caseworkers' salaries were increased to attract and retain qualified professionals. But perhaps the most profound change was cultural and attitudinal. Foster care was no longer a hidden crisis that polite society preferred not to discuss. It was a topic of national conversation happening in workplaces, schools, churches, and homes across the country. Children in the system were no longer invisible, forgotten statistics. They were seen, acknowledged, valued, and prioritized by society in ways they had never been before. The stigma surrounding foster care began to diminish as more people understood the realities these children faced. Steve's breakdown on that Tuesday evening had done infinitely more than go viral and rack up millions of views. It had awakened an entire nation to its moral responsibility and obligation to care for its most vulnerable, children. And he was just getting started. The real work, the long-term, sustained effort to transform the system, was only beginning. 3 months after launching the Harvey Foster Care Initiative, Steve found himself standing in front of a modest brick building in downtown Atlanta. The sign above the door read, "Hope House, a safe haven for foster youth." This was his first official visit as part of his commitment to meet foster children and families across the country, to understand their lives beyond statistics and news headlines. As he stepped through the doors, Steve was greeted by the director, Ms. Patricia Williams, a woman in her 60s who had dedicated nearly 4 decades of her life to caring for children in the system. Her eyes were warm but weary, reflecting the weight of countless stories she carried with her. She led Steve through the facility, showing him the common areas where children gathered, the bedrooms where they slept, the kitchen where meals were prepared with love and care. What struck Steve most profoundly was the ordinariness of it all. These weren't tragic figures on a television screen. They were kids, teenagers mostly, ranging from ages 14 to 17, who were doing homework, watching television, playing video games, and joking with each other just like any other group of young people. But underlying their laughter and normalcy was a deep current of pain and uncertainty about their futures. Steve spent hours talking with the residents. He sat with a 16-year-old named Marcus, who had been in the system for 8 years, moved between 12 different homes. Marcus had learned not to unpack his belongings completely, keeping a bag ready at all times in case another placement fell through. He dreamed of becoming an engineer, but worried that his lack of stability would prevent him from getting into college. He listened to 17-year-old Keisha, who had aged out of the system just 6 months earlier and was now living independently in a small apartment, with help from a nonprofit organization. She spoke about the terror of her 18th birthday, the moment when the system that had raised her simply cut her loose. She had no family to fall back on, no safety net. She was working 2 part-time jobs just to afford rent and food, and her dreams of attending college felt impossibly distant. He met with 15-year-old James, who had recently been reunified with his biological mother after years of hoping for exactly that outcome. But the reunion had been complicated and painful. His mother struggled with addiction, and James found himself in the role of caregiver, worrying about her rather than focusing on his own development. He was torn between gratitude for having family and fear about what his future held. Each story was unique, but they all shared common threads: trauma, resilience, uncertainty, and an aching desire to belong to something stable and permanent. Steve realized that no amount of viral videos or policy initiatives could fully capture the complexity of what these young people were experiencing. After his time at Hope House, Steve visited a foster family in the suburbs, the Johnsons, who had been foster parents for 15 years and had permanently adopted 7 children from the system. As he sat around their dinner table, watching the organized chaos of a large blended family, Steve saw what was possible when love and commitment met opportunity. The children, now ranging from young adults to teenagers, spoke about how the Johnsons' decision to take them in had literally saved their lives. But the Johnsons were also candid about the challenges. They spoke about the emotional toll of caring for traumatized children, the financial strain despite subsidies, the lack of adequate mental health support, and the social stigma they sometimes faced from people who didn't understand foster care. They told Steve that they were the exception, not the rule. That most foster families needed more support, more training, and more resources than they currently received. Armed with these first-hand experiences, Steve began a series of town halls across the country. In cities from Los Angeles to New York, from Chicago to Miami, he brought together foster children, foster parents, social workers, caseworkers, and policymakers. He created spaces where people could share their stories openly and honestly, where the voices of those most affected by the system could be heard directly by those in positions of power. These town halls became emotional, powerful events. Foster children spoke about their experiences with raw honesty. Parents broke down describing the challenges of raising children with trauma histories. Social workers talked about being overwhelmed and underpaid. Caseworkers shared stories of children they couldn't save despite their best efforts. The conversations were difficult, sometimes heated, but always authentic. Steve documented these visits and town halls for a special series on his show. Each episode featured real stories from real people, interspersed with expert commentary and policy discussions. The ratings were phenomenal, but more importantly, the impact was undeniable. Viewers were moved to action. Thousands of people called the initiative hotline, expressing interest in becoming foster parents. Donations continued to flow in. Politicians who had previously ignored the issue began paying attention. One particularly moving moment came when Marcus, the 16-year-old from Hope House, appeared on Steve's show. Marcus talked about his journey through the system, his fears about aging out, his dreams despite the obstacles. When Steve asked him what he needed most, Marcus's answer was simple and profound. "I just want someone to believe in me. I want someone to say, 'You matter. Your life matters. I'm not going to give up on you.'" The studio audience was silent, many with tears streaming down their faces. Steve reached across the table and took Marcus's hand. "I believe in you," he said. "And I know thousands of people watching this right now believe in you too." That episode went viral again, this time with a different energy. Instead of shock and outrage, it sparked hope and determination. The Harvey foster care initiative's phone lines were flooded with calls. Foster care agencies reported unprecedented numbers of people inquiring about becoming foster parents. Corporations pledged additional funding. Universities began developing specialized programs to support foster youth in higher education. But Steve knew that visibility and good intentions weren't enough. The real work was just beginning, the slow, patient, sometimes frustrating work of actually changing systems, reforming policies, and ensuring that every foster child received the support and resources they needed to thrive. 6 months into the Harvey foster care initiative, Steve sat in a high-stakes conference room on Capitol Hill, surrounded by influential legislators, renowned policy experts, dedicated social workers, and passionate representatives from foster care organizations across the nation. The room buzzed with palpable energy and shared sense of purpose. On the polished mahogany table in front of them lay a comprehensive legislative package that had been painstakingly developed over months of research, consultation, and collaboration. The Foster Care Reform and Support Act, a sweeping, transformative bill designed to address the systemic failures and institutional neglect that had plagued the American foster care system for decades, harming countless vulnerable children. The bill was remarkably ambitious and multifaceted in its scope, addressing virtually every aspect of the foster care system. It included detailed provisions for caseworker training standards, maximum caseload limits to prevent overwhelming individual workers, permanency timelines to ensure children didn't languish in temporary placements, and comprehensive educational support for foster youth. It included provisions for significantly increased federal funding to states, financial incentives to encourage kinship care placements and family preservation efforts, enhanced mental health services for traumatized children, and robust college preparation programs for older youth preparing to age out of the system. Most importantly, the legislation had been shaped directly by the voices of those most affected by the system: foster children themselves, dedicated foster parents who understood the challenges firsthand, and frontline social workers who dealt with the consequences of systemic failure every single day. Senator Patricia Morrison, a veteran legislator with nearly 30 years of experience who chaired the powerful Senate Committee on Children and Families, had taken the personal lead on shepherding the bill through the complex legislative process. She had been deeply moved by Steve's emotionally powerful testimony before her committee and by the countless stories she had heard during the nationwide town halls. In a private meeting with Steve in her office, she had spoken with genuine conviction. This isn't just about policy and procedure. This is about our nation's fundamental moral character and values. How we treat our most vulnerable and defenseless children defines who we are as a society. This bill is about declaring that we will do better. Steve had undergone a steep learning curve regarding the intricacies of the political process over the previous months. He had come to understand that changing entrenched systems required not just good intentions, but patience, persistence, strategic thinking, and careful coalition building. He had spent countless hours, early mornings, late nights, weekends, meeting individually with legislators from both parties, presenting meticulously researched data, sharing emotionally compelling stories from foster children and families, and methodically building support for the legislation. He had worked closely with advocacy organizations that had been fighting these battles for years, finally giving them a national platform and substantial resources they had desperately lacked for so long. The bill faced determined opposition from various quarters and ideological perspectives. Some conservative politicians argued that it represented government overreach and violated principles of federalism. Some fiscal hawks expressed deep concerns about the substantial budget implications and long-term costs. Some state officials worried about federal mandates that would limit their autonomy and flexibility. Some business interests questioned whether the funding mechanisms were sound. But Steve and his carefully assembled coalition had anticipated these objections and had prepared thoughtfully reasoned, evidence-based responses backed by rigorous research, pilot program data, and expert testimony. What ultimately made the decisive difference was the mobilization of genuine public support. The Harvey Foster Care Initiative had successfully mobilized millions of ordinary Americans who cared deeply about this issue and were willing to take action. Heartfelt letters poured into congressional offices from constituents across the country. Town halls were packed to capacity with passionate citizens demanding action from their representatives. Sophisticated social media campaigns highlighted the personal stories of foster children and families, making the issue real and tangible rather than abstract. Corporate leaders publicly endorsed the legislation, lending their credibility and influence. Faith leaders spoke from their pulpits about the moral and spiritual imperative to care for vulnerable children. Celebrities and public figures added their voices to the chorus, calling for change. One particularly powerful and transformative moment came when Marcus, the thoughtful, articulate 16-year-old from Hope House, testified before the full Senate Committee on Children and Families. He sat at a simple table facing the committee members, his voice steady and clear, despite his obvious nervousness about speaking in such a formal, intimidating setting. He spoke with raw honesty about his deeply personal experiences navigating the foster care system. The 12 different placements over 8 years, the constant upheaval and uncertainty, the fear that came with each new move, the emotional toll of never knowing if he would be wanted or kept. "I'm asking you to pass this bill," Marcus said, looking directly into the eyes of each senator, his voice growing stronger with conviction. "Not just for me, but for the thousands of kids like me who are in the system right now, who are struggling every single day. We deserve a real chance at a better future. We deserve stability and permanence. We deserve to know that we matter to society, that someone cares about what happens to us, that our lives have value and meaning." There wasn't a dry eye in the committee room. Even the most hardened, cynical politicians seemed genuinely moved by the raw authenticity of Marcus's words. Senator Morrison later told Steve in confidence that Marcus's testimony had been the crucial turning point in the legislative process. That several previously undecided senators had been profoundly moved by his words in ways that no amount of statistics, policy arguments, or expert testimony could have possibly achieved. After months of intense debate, careful amendment, and complex negotiation between different factions and interests, the Foster Care Reform and Support Act finally passed both chambers of Congress with surprising bipartisan support. It wasn't perfect. The messy process of compromise had required modifications to the original proposal, but it was comprehensive, meaningful, and represented a genuine commitment to systemic reform. When the president signed the bill into law in a formal ceremony attended by Steve, grateful foster youth, dedicated foster parents, frontline social workers, and journalists, there was a palpable sense that something significant and transformative had fundamentally changed in America's approach to foster care. The legislation allocated $2 billion in additional annual federal funding for states to implement comprehensive reforms. It established rigorous new standards for caseworker training and education, recognizing that these professionals needed better preparation and support. It mandated reduced maximum caseloads for caseworkers, acknowledging that many had been overwhelmed by impossible workloads that prevented them from providing adequate attention to individual children. It created meaningful financial incentives for kinship care placements, recognizing that children often did better with relatives rather than strangers. It emphasized family preservation efforts, providing resources to help keep families together when possible. It mandated trauma-informed practices across the entire system, ensuring that professionals understood how trauma affects children's behavior and development. It established comprehensive educational support programs for foster youth, including college preparation, tutoring, and scholarship opportunities. It created extended support services for youth aging out of the system, recognizing that 18 wasn't a magical age when young people suddenly became ready for complete independence and self-sufficiency. But perhaps most importantly, the legislation included provisions for ongoing evaluation, accountability, and continuous improvement. States would be required to systematically track outcomes, permanency rates, educational achievement, employment outcomes for former foster youth, mental health indicators, and other key performance metrics. The system would be held publicly accountable for results, with transparent reporting and consequences for underperformance. Implementation of the new law would necessarily take considerable time. Bureaucracies move slowly, and changing entrenched systems deeply rooted in decades of practice is never quick or easy. But the direction had been clearly set. The resources had been allocated. The expectations had been established. Change was coming, and it couldn't be stopped or reversed. Steve strategically used his platform and media presence to track implementation progress, to hold states accountable for results, and to celebrate meaningful progress. He featured inspiring stories of children who found permanent, loving homes under the new system. He highlighted states that were exceeding expectations in their reform efforts and serving as models for others. He also continued to shine a bright light on remaining challenges and shortcomings, pushing for continuous improvement and refusing to allow complacency. The initiative expanded its focus beyond policy advocacy to include direct services to those in need. With substantial funds from corporate partners and generous individual donors, the Harvey Foster Care Initiative established its own comprehensive programs. A national mentorship network connecting foster youth with successful adults who could serve as role models and guides. A substantial college scholarship fund specifically for foster youth. A comprehensive training program for prospective and current foster parents. And a 24/7 crisis hotline for young people aging out of the system who needed immediate support and guidance. 1 year after the bill was signed into law, Steve stood in front of a gymnasium filled with hundreds of foster youth who had directly benefited from the new programs and policies. They ranged in age from young teenagers just entering the system to young adults who had successfully transitioned to independence. Many of them had found permanent homes and stable placements. Others were in significantly improved situations compared to before. All of them had experienced the tangible, life-changing impact of the reforms that had been set in motion by the collective effort of so many people. "Look at what we've accomplished together," Steve said, his voice filled with genuine emotion and gratitude. "Look at these young people standing before you. A year ago, these remarkable individuals were largely invisible to most of America, hidden away in a system that society preferred not to think about. Now, because of your generosity, your compassion, and your unwavering commitment to change, they have hope. They have meaningful support. They have people who believe in them and are invested in their success. That's what real change looks like." The crowd erupted in thunderous cheers and sustained applause. But Steve knew with absolute clarity that the work was far from over. Changing a system this large and complex, this deeply rooted in decades of neglect, underfunding, and institutional indifference, would require years, maybe even decades, of sustained effort. There would inevitably be setbacks and challenges. There would be resistance from those invested in the status quo. There would be budget battles and political changes. But the momentum had fundamentally shifted. The national conversation had changed. Foster children were no longer invisible. The issue had moved from the margins to the center of national consciousness.